For 18 years, a mother kept a bedroom untouched, toys arranged as if waiting for small hands to return. In Garland, Texas, the name Roxanne Hope Reyes became whispered legend, a 3-year-old girl who vanished on an autumn afternoon in 1987, stolen from a world that believed children were safe. Her case went cold, files gathered dust, but some truths refused to stay buried. When investigators finally connected the dots across state lines, they uncovered a predator hiding in plain sight and a community's long-awaited reckoning with evil that had walked among them undetected. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning sun filtered through oak trees lining Maple Street in Garland, Texas, painting golden squares across quiet sidewalks. November 3rd, 1987 began like any other Tuesday in this corner of Dallas County. Peaceful, predictable, safe. Children's bicycles rested against front porches. Neighbors waved from driveways as they headed to work. 3-year-old Roxanne Hope Reyes stepped into her backyard, her dark hair catching sunlight as she examined a butterfly resting on her mother's rosebush. Her laughter bubbled through the morning air, pure, infectious joy that seemed to illuminate everything around her. She wore a pink sweater and small sneakers that left tiny prints in the soft earth near the garden. "Stay where I can see you, Mija," her mother called from the kitchen window, watching her daughter explore the world with the fearless curiosity that defined her personality. Roxanne looked up and waved, her smile radiant. The community of Garland moved through their routines with casual confidence. Mrs. Chen watered her plants next door. Mr. Rodriguez backed his truck out of his driveway, heading to his construction job. Children walked to school in groups, backpacks bouncing, voices carrying across the neighborhood. Nobody noticed the car that had been parked at the corner for the past hour. Nobody saw the figure watching from behind tinted windows, studying the rhythm of family life on Maple Street. Roxanne picked up a fallen leaf, turning it over in her small hands. She wandered toward the edge of the yard, drawn by something glittering in the grass. The butterfly followed her, its wings catching the light like stained glass. The morning held its breath. Time stretched into a perfect, fragile moment, a little girl discovering beauty in her own backyard, surrounded by the love and safety her family had built around her. Then, in an instant, everything changed. By noon, the autumn warmth had settled over Garland like a comfortable blanket. Roxanne's mother finished folding laundry, glancing periodically through the window to check on her daughter. The backyard appeared empty. "Roxanne?" she called from the doorway. No response. She stepped outside, scanning the garden, the small play area, the space behind the storage shed. "Roxanne, time for lunch." Silence. Panic began as a flutter in her chest. She called louder, her voice carrying across neighboring yards. She checked the front yard, the sidewalk, the spaces between houses. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the urgency in her voice. "Have you seen Roxanne?" she asked Mrs. Chen, who was hanging clothes on her line. "Not since this morning," Mrs. Chen replied, her expression shifting from casual concern to alarm. "She was playing by your roses." The mother ran back inside and dialed 911, her hands trembling as she pressed the numbers. "My daughter is missing. She's 3 years old. She was just in our backyard." Within 10 minutes, patrol cars began arriving on Maple Street. The detective stepped out of the first vehicle, his experienced eyes immediately assessing the scene. He had worked missing child cases before, knew the critical importance of the first few hours. "When did you last see her?" he asked Roxanne's mother, his voice calm but urgent. "Around 10 this morning. She was playing in the backyard. I was inside for maybe 30 minutes doing laundry." The detective organized the immediate response. Officers fanned out across the neighborhood, knocking on doors, checking yards and garages. Neighbors joined the search without being asked, calling Roxanne's name through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar and threatening. A neighbor approached the detective, nervousness evident in her voice. "There was a car parked at the corner this morning. I noticed it because it sat there for a while. Dark-colored, maybe blue or black." The detective made notes, already understanding that this detail might be crucial. Cars that lingered in residential neighborhoods rarely belonged to residents. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the search expanded. Volunteers distributed hastily printed flyers with Roxanne's photograph, her bright smile now a desperate plea for help. The community of Garland mobilized with an intensity that surprised even longtime residents. By evening, Patrol cars swept through ever-widening circles, their headlights cutting through darkness that felt heavier than usual. The cheerful neighborhood of morning had transformed into something else entirely, a place where a child could simply disappear. The Garland Police Department Command Center buzzed with controlled urgency as night fell on November 3rd. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins indicating search areas, witness locations, and potential leads. Radio chatter provided constant updates from field units, sweeping drainage ditches, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas throughout Dallas County. The detective coordinated multiple search teams while fielding calls from concerned citizens. Missing child cases demanded immediate, massive response. Statistics showed that the first 72 hours were critical for recovery. "We've got K-9 units coming in from Dallas PD," an officer reported. "They'll start at the house and work outward." Volunteers streamed through the station, offering to distribute flyers, coordinate food for searchers, and provide whatever assistance the investigation needed. The community of Garland had transformed into a unified force, their usual quiet routines abandoned in favor of finding one small girl. A detective approached with evidence bags. "Found this in the drainage ditch behind Maple Street." He held up a small sneaker, pink with white laces. Roxanne's mother examined it carefully, hope and dread warring in her expression. "It's not hers. Roxanne was wearing blue sneakers today." Relief and disappointment mixed in the command center. Every potential clue carried the weight of possibility, but false leads drained emotional energy and precious time. The search dogs arrived as midnight approached. German shepherds trained in tracking missing persons began at Roxanne's backyard, noses to the ground, following scent trails that might reveal where she had gone. The lead dog picked up a trail moving away from the house, toward the street corner where the suspicious car had been parked. The scent continued for several blocks before disappearing entirely near the main road, suggesting vehicle transport. "She didn't wander off," the detective concluded, watching the dog handler's grim expression. "Someone took her." The investigation officially shifted from missing child to suspected abduction. The FBI was contacted for potential interstate assistance. Amber Alert protocols, still in their early implementation, were activated across Texas. As dawn approached on November 4th, exhausted searchers took brief breaks while new volunteers arrived to continue the effort. The community of Garland had barely slept, sustained by coffee and desperate hope. Roxanne's mother sat in the police station, clutching a photograph of her daughter. Around her, the machinery of law enforcement worked tirelessly, but she understood with growing horror that her little girl was somewhere out there, afraid and alone. The search expanded to surrounding counties as the sun rose on the second day of Roxanne Hope Reyes's disappearance. 2 days after Roxanne vanished, the search had expanded to cover hundreds of square miles across North Texas. Volunteers organized into systematic grid patterns, combing through fields, creek beds, and rural areas where someone might attempt to hide evidence. The community of Garland had grown to include residents from neighboring towns, all united by the desperate need to find one missing child. The detective coordinated with Texas Rangers and FBI agents, sharing information across jurisdictional lines. Missing child investigations required resources no single department could provide alone. "We're extending the search to Lavon," he announced during the morning briefing. "Rural areas, fishing spots, anywhere someone might go to avoid detection." Lavon lay northeast of Garland, a sparsely populated area of fields and small lakes, popular with hunters and fishermen. If someone wanted isolation, the back roads around Lavon provided it. Search dogs began working the area methodically. Helicopters provided aerial support, their rotors beating steady rhythms across the autumn sky. Ground teams moved through tall grass and mesquite thickets, calling Roxanne's name into spaces that seemed to swallow sound. The community response had evolved into something remarkable and heartbreaking. Parents who had never spoken to each other now worked side by side, unified by the shared understanding that this could happen to any family. Children stayed indoors or moved in groups, their usual freedom replaced by careful supervision. Local businesses donated food, supplies, and volunteer hours. Churches organized prayer vigils. Radio stations broadcast updates every hour, keeping Roxanne's disappearance at the forefront of public attention. But beneath the mobilization lay a growing fear that transformed the social fabric of Garland. Neighbors who had trusted their quiet streets now installed new locks. Parents who had allowed children to play freely now maintained constant watch. The very assumptions about safety that had defined their community were cracking. By afternoon, the search teams working around Lavon had found nothing significant. Empty fields stretched toward the horizon, punctuated by small groves and farm buildings. The vastness of the search area began to weigh on everyone involved. "It's like looking for a needle in a haystack," one volunteer confided to another, "but we can't stop looking." As the sun set on November 5th, the search continued under portable lights. The detective stood in a field near Lavon, watching dozens of volunteers refuse to quit despite growing exhaustion. Somewhere out there, Roxanne Hope Reyes was waiting to be found. The question that haunted everyone was whether she would be found alive. The call came at 7:43 a.m. on November 9th, 6 days after Roxanne's disappearance. A local resident walking his property near Lavon had discovered something that made him immediately contact police. The detective arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, his stomach tight with the dread that had been building since the first day of the search. Deep in a field bordered by mesquite trees and tall grass, approximately 2 miles from the main road, a small form lay partially concealed. The coroner confirmed what everyone had feared but hoped against. Roxanne Hope Reyes had been found. The scene told a horrific story. Evidence indicated that she had been abducted, subjected to violent assault, and murdered shortly after her disappearance. The isolation of the location suggested someone familiar with the area, someone who knew where to go to avoid detection. News of the discovery spread through Garland like wildfire. The community that had sustained itself on hope for 6 days now faced the devastating reality of loss. Vigils that had prayed for her safe return transformed into memorials honoring her brief life. The detective stood at the edge of the field as crime scene technicians processed evidence. The methodical nature of the dumping site indicated someone organized, someone who had planned this carefully, but despite thorough investigation, physical evidence remained frustratingly limited. The technology of 1987 couldn't provide the forensic tools that would become standard in later decades. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Fingerprint databases were limited. The investigation would have to rely on witness accounts, physical evidence, and traditional detective work. Roxanne's mother collapsed upon hearing the news. The family that had maintained desperate hope now faced a grief too enormous to comprehend. Their 3-year-old daughter had been stolen, brutalized, and discarded like refuse. The evil that had visited their family defied understanding. The community of Garland gathered that evening for a memorial service. At the local church, hundreds attended, including many who had never met Roxanne but felt connected to her through the shared experience of searching and hoping. The detective attended the service, standing in the back of the crowded sanctuary. He had worked homicide cases for 15 years, but the murder of a 3-year-old child affected him differently. This wasn't just a case file, it was the destruction of innocence, the violation of everything decent people believed about their world. As the service concluded, he made a silent promise to Roxanne and her family. This case would never be forgotten. Somewhere out there was a monster who had stolen a little girl's life, and justice would eventually find him, even if it took decades. The Garland Police Department's investigation into Roxanne's murder consumed the following weeks with exhaustive thoroughness. The detective interviewed family members, neighbors, and anyone who had been in the area during the time of her disappearance. The coroner's report confirmed the worst fears. Roxanne had died within hours of her abduction, the victim of a violent predator. The forensic evidence painted a picture of calculated evil. The killer had approached quietly, taken her without struggle or significant resistance, and transported her to an isolated location where he could commit his crimes without interruption. The remote field near Lavon suggested local knowledge, someone who understood the area's geography. This wasn't random, the detective explained to his superiors. The location, the timing, the method, everything indicates planning and familiarity with the area. The investigation explored every possible angle. Family members were interviewed and cleared. Registered offenders in the area were questioned and investigated. The mysterious dark car reported by neighbors became a central focus, but without license plate information or specific description, it remained frustratingly vague. The community of Garland struggled to process the reality of Roxanne's murder. Parents installed new security measures. Children were kept under closer supervision. The casual trust that had characterized the neighborhood disappeared, replaced by wariness and fear. Local media coverage intensified, bringing statewide attention to the case. The story of a 3-year-old girl murdered in what should have been a safe community resonated across Texas, generating tips and leads that investigators pursued methodically. But as weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. Despite hundreds of interviews, extensive forensic work, and collaboration with state and federal agencies, no suspect emerged. The physical evidence, while confirming the violent nature of the crime, pointed to no specific individual. The detective found himself working the case during off hours, reviewing files and evidence, searching for connections that might have been missed. Roxanne's photograph remained on his desk, a constant reminder of justice delayed but not forgotten. By late 1988, the case had been officially designated as cold. Active investigation scaled back, though the file remained open and accessible. New leads would still be pursued, but the intense daily focus had shifted to more recent cases. Roxanne's family struggled with the reality that their daughter's killer might never be found. The mother kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been on November 3, 1987, toys arranged as if waiting for small hands to return. The community of Garland slowly adapted to new realities. Children grew up understanding that the world contained dangers their parents' generation had only read about in newspapers. Trust became conditional. Safety became something to be actively maintained rather than simply assumed. The case file for Roxanne Hope Reyes joined hundreds of others in storage unsolved mysteries, waiting for new evidence, new technology, or new connections that might finally provide answers. As 1988 faded into memory, Roxanne's case settled into the quiet limbo of cold files. The detective, now carrying dozens of other investigations, still kept her photograph on his desk. The annual anniversary of her disappearance brought brief media attention, dutiful reminders that her killer remained free, but public attention inevitably moved to more recent tragedies. The mother established a small memorial scholarship in Roxanne's name, finding purpose in helping other children, even as her own heart remained broken. The community of Garland had learned to live with the knowledge that evil had visited their quiet streets, leaving scars that would never fully heal. But in the wider world of law enforcement, changes were beginning that would eventually reach back to touch cases like Roxanne's. Computer databases were expanding. Forensic science was advancing. Most importantly, investigators were beginning to understand that seemingly isolated crimes might actually be connected across vast distances and time periods. In 1989, a detective in Louisiana noticed similarities between a child murder in his jurisdiction and several unsolved cases from other states. The victim profile was eerily consistent: young girls, ages 3 to 9, abducted quickly, found in rural locations. The methodology suggested a single predator moving across state lines. Meanwhile, in Ohio, law enforcement was tracking a man named David Elliott Penton, whose criminal history included violence against children. His movements across multiple states during the 1980s were beginning to attract attention from investigators who specialized in pattern crimes. The analysts working cold cases in the early 1990s began noting connections that earlier technology hadn't allowed investigators to see. Names, dates, locations, and methods could now be cross-referenced across state databases, revealing patterns that might have remained hidden in individual case files. Roxanne's file occasionally surfaced in these broader investigations, but without specific evidence linking her case to others, it remained one of many tragic mysteries from an era when investigators lacked the tools to see connections across jurisdictional boundaries. The detective in Garland, now approaching retirement, sometimes pulled Roxanne's file during quiet moments, reviewing witness statements and evidence reports that had been memorized through repetition. He had worked hundreds of cases over his career, but some victims stayed with you. Some faces refused to fade. The community had evolved around the absence Roxanne's death had created. Children who had been her age in 1987 were now teenagers, raised with the awareness of danger that their parents' generation had never known. Trust had been replaced by vigilance, innocence by careful caution, but somewhere in the expanding network of law enforcement databases and criminal weight tracking systems, connections were beginning to form that would eventually reach back to a field near Lavon, Texas, and the memory of a 3-year-old girl whose death had never been avenged. The wheels of justice moved slowly, but they never stopped turning entirely. The late 1990s brought revolutionary changes to criminal investigations across America. Computer databases now allowed analysts to search across state lines instantly, comparing crime patterns that had previously been trapped in individual filing cabinets. The analyst working in the newly formed cold case unit spent her days connecting dots that earlier investigators could never have seen. On an autumn morning in 1998, she spread case files across her desk like pieces of a massive puzzle. Child murders from Texas, Louisiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, all sharing disturbing similarities in victim selection, abduction methods, and disposal sites. Young girls between ages 3 and 9. Quick, efficient abductions. Rural dumping grounds near water or brush. Look at this. she said to her supervisor, pointing to crime scene photographs and timeline charts. Same age range, same methodology, same type of location. The pattern was undeniable. What had appeared to be isolated tragedies were actually connected by the movements of a single predator who had crossed state boundaries for over a decade. The name David Elliott Penton appeared in multiple investigative files. Already serving a life sentence in Ohio for the murder of a young girl, his background revealed a pattern of movement that aligned suspiciously with the unsolved cases. Military records, parole documents, and employment history showed him living in Texas, Louisiana, and Ohio during the precise timeframes when the murders had occurred. The analyst pulled Roxanne's file from the Texas stack. November 3, 1987, Garland, Texas, 3 years old, found near Lavon in an isolated field. According to Penton's documented whereabouts, he had been living in the Dallas area during late 1987, working construction and living in a rented room just 20 miles from Maple Street. The breakthrough felt electric. After 11 years of cold silence, connections were finally emerging that might explain what had happened to Roxanne Hope Reyes. The detective in Garland received the call on a Thursday afternoon. "We think we might have something on the Reyes case," the analyst explained. "There's a pattern involving a suspect already in custody in Ohio." For the first time in over a decade, hope rekindled in the investigation that had haunted his career. The case that had gone cold in 1988 was warming again, suggesting that justice delayed might not mean justice denied. The community of Garland had moved forward with their lives, but the families of victims never truly moved past their losses. Roxanne's mother still kept her daughter's room as it had been, still visited her grave every week, still wondered if the person who had stolen her child's life would ever be held accountable. As 1998 ended, investigators began the complex process of building a case across state lines and decades of time. The technology of the late 1990s was providing answers to questions that had seemed unanswerable in 1987. Somewhere in an Ohio prison, David Elliott Penton continued serving his sentence, unaware that investigators were connecting him to crimes he thought had been forgotten by time and distance. The new millennium brought intensive focus to the Roxanne Reyes investigation as part of a broader multi-state cold case initiative. The analyst had compiled compelling evidence linking David Elliott Penton to a series of child murders across multiple states, with Roxanne's case fitting the pattern with disturbing precision. The detective, though officially retired, remained involved in the investigation as a consultant. The case had defined the final decades of his career, and he was determined to see it resolved. Working with federal authorities and Ohio prison officials, arrangements were made for the first formal interview with Penton regarding the Texas cases. "We're going to approach this systematically," the lead FBI agent explained during pre-interview planning. "He's already serving life without parole, so he has nothing to lose by talking. But he also has no incentive to confess unless we can demonstrate that we already know he was involved." The evidence package they assembled was comprehensive. Penton's documented presence in Texas during November 1987, vehicle registrations matching the description provided by Garland witnesses, employment records placing him in construction work that required travel throughout North Texas, including areas near Lavon. Most significantly, behavioral analysis of Roxanne's abduction and murder matched Penton's established pattern exactly. The quick, efficient approach. The transportation to an isolated location, the specific type of rural area where the body was found, everything aligned with his known methodology. The community of Garland watched news coverage of the developing investigation with mixture of hope and apprehension. 11 years after Roxanne's murder, the possibility of answers seemed almost too fragile to believe. Roxanne's mother struggled with conflicting emotions. The prospect of finally knowing who had killed her daughter offered the possibility of closure she had never expected. But reopening the investigation also meant reliving the worst period of her life, confronting again the horror of what had been done to her child. The first interview was scheduled for March 2001 at the maximum security facility in Ohio, where Penton was housed. Investigators from Texas, FBI behavioral analysts, and legal representatives would all participate in questioning designed to elicit information about his activities in Texas during the late 1980s. "We're going to get one chance at this," the detective told his colleagues before departing for Ohio. "He's been in prison for over a decade. He's had time to think about what he wants to say and what he doesn't. We need to be prepared for anything." The flight to Ohio carried more than just investigators and legal documents. It carried the hopes of a family that had waited 14 years for answers, a community that had never forgotten a little girl who had vanished from their streets, and the professional dedication of law enforcement officers who had never stopped believing that justice was possible. As the plane descended toward Columbus, the detective looked out at the landscape below and thought about Roxanne Hope Reyes, whose case had shaped his understanding of what police work really meant. Some investigations were about solving puzzles. This investigation was about honoring the memory of a child who had deserved better from the world. The Ohio State Correctional Institution sat like a gray fortress against the March sky, its walls containing some of the most dangerous criminals in the state's history. David Elliott Penton had been housed here since 1992, serving life without parole for the murder of a 7-year-old girl in Cleveland. The interview room was sterile and institutional concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and a metal table bolted to the floor. Penton entered in shackles, his appearance unremarkable except for the cold calculation visible in his eyes. He had agreed to the interview but remained under no obligation to provide truthful answers. "We're here to discuss your time in Texas during the late 1980s, the FBI agent began, keeping his tone neutral and professional. "Specifically, your presence in the Dallas area during November 1987. Penton's response was immediate denial. "I've never been to Texas," he stated flatly, despite documented evidence proving otherwise. The detective from Garland placed a photograph on the table. Roxanne Hope Reyes, smiling at the camera, 3 years old and full of life. "This little girl was murdered while you were living 20 miles from her house." Penton glanced at the photograph without apparent emotion. "I don't know anything about that." For 2 hours, investigators presented evidence methodically. Vehicle registration documents showing Penton had owned a car matching witness descriptions. Employment records proving his presence in North Texas. Timeline analysis demonstrating his availability during the exact window when Roxanne had disappeared. Penton maintained his denials, but the investigators noticed subtle slight shifts in posture when certain details were mentioned, brief hesitations before responding to specific questions. He was lying, but experienced interrogators understood that breaking a suspect required patience and persistence. The interview ended without confession, but investigators sensed weakness in Penton's facade. "We'll be back," the agent informed him as guards prepared to return him to his cell. "This investigation isn't going away." News of the interview reached Texas within hours. The community of Garland followed developments closely, though many residents warned against false hope. They had lived with disappointment before and understood that prison interviews didn't guarantee resolution. Roxanne's mother received updates through victim services coordinators, but maintained emotional distance from the investigation details. 14 years of grief had taught her that hope was dangerous until it was validated by concrete results. The detective returned to Texas convinced that Penton was their man, but frustrated by the lack of immediate confession. "He knows we're right," he told colleagues, "but he's had years to prepare for this conversation. We need a different approach." The investigation team regrouped to plan their next strategy. Penton's initial denials were expected, but his body language and verbal responses provided valuable information for behavioral analysts. The next interview would be structured differently, focusing on psychological pressure rather than evidence presentation. As spring arrived in Garland, the detective drove past Maple Street, where Roxanne had played on that last morning in 1987. The house looked different now, new owners, different landscaping, but he could still envision a 3-year-old girl exploring her backyard, unaware that evil was watching from a car parked at the corner. Justice was close. He could feel it. The second interview took place 6 weeks later, with investigators employing a different psychological approach. Instead of presenting evidence directly, they focused on behavioral analysis and the psychological profile that had led them to Penton in the first place. "We know you were in Texas," the FBI behavioral analyst began, her voice calm but confident. "We know about the pattern. The question isn't whether you were involved, it's whether you want to tell the truth about what happened." The strategy was designed to bypass Penton's prepared denials by treating his guilt as established fact. Rather than asking if he had committed the crime, investigators asked him to explain how it had occurred. Penton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The composed denial of the first interview began to crack under sustained psychological pressure. "You don't understand," he said finally. "It's not that simple." "Then help us understand," the detective urged, leaning forward slightly. "Tell us what really happened on November 3, 1987. For the first time, Penton's story began to change. Minor admissions emerged. Yes, he had been in Texas. Yes, he remembered the area around Garland. Yes, he knew about the case because it had been in the newspapers. The breakthrough came when Penton began describing details that had never been released to the public. The specific location where Roxanne's body had been found, the condition of her clothing, the timeline of her disappearance. Information that only the killer or someone who had extensive access to crime scene reports could have known. I was driving around that day, Penton said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw her playing in the yard. She was so small, so trusting. The room fell silent as investigators recognized that they were hearing the first direct account of Roxanne's final hours. After 14 years of speculation and investigation, the truth was finally emerging from the mouth of her killer. Penton's confession unfolded over the next hour, delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of a man describing mundane events rather than horrific crimes. He described approaching Roxanne, convincing her to come with him, transporting her to the field near Lavon, where he assaulted and murdered her. The details matched the demon, physical evidence exactly. The timeline aligned with witness accounts. The location description corresponded to the crime scene photographs. There was no doubt that they were hearing the truth from someone who had been present during Roxanne's final moments. Why? The detective asked, though he knew the answer might be incomprehensible. Penton's response chilled everyone in the room. Because I wanted to and because I could. The interview continued for another 2 hours, with investigators confirming details and ensuring that Penton's account was complete and accurate. By the time it ended, they had obtained a full confession to the murder of Roxanne Hope Reyes, corroborated by physical evidence and behavioral analysis. As Penton was returned to his cell, investigators sat in stunned silence. After 14 years of questions, they finally had answers. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. The truth they had uncovered was horrible, but it was still the truth. The news reached Texas within hours of Penton's confession. The detective called Roxanne's mother personally, his voice heavy with the weight of finally delivering answers she had waited 14 years to receive. "We have a confession," he said simply. "David Elliott Penton has admitted to killing Roxanne. He provided details that only the person who was there could have known." The silence on the phone stretched for long moments before Roxanne's mother could respond. "Are you certain? After all this time, are you absolutely certain?" "Yes, ma'am, we're certain." The emotional release was immediate and overwhelming. 14 years of questions, suspicions, and sleepless nights collapsed into the simple fact that her daughter's killer had finally been identified. Relief mixed with renewed grief as the reality of what had been done to Roxanne was confirmed by the man who had done it. The formal announcement came at a press conference held at the Garland Police Department. Media representatives from across North Texas gathered to hear news that had been awaited since 1987. After 14 years of investigation, we can announce that the murder of Roxanne Hope Reyes has been solved, the chief of police stated. David Elliott Penton, currently serving life imprisonment in Ohio, has confessed to her abduction and murder. The community of Garland reacted with mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice had finally arrived, but it could never restore what had been lost. Parents who had raised their children under the shadow of Roxanne's murder felt vindicated in their caution, but also mourned again for the innocence that had been stolen from their neighborhood. The confession was formally processed through legal channels, with prosecutors in Texas coordinating with Ohio authorities to ensure that Penton's admission was properly documented and legally valid. Although he was already serving life without parole, the solved case provided closure for the family and community. The detective, now fully retired, attended the press conference as a private citizen rather than an official representative. Roxanne's case had been the defining investigation of his career, and seeing it resolved felt like completing a promise made to a 3-year-old girl whose life had been cut short by inexplicable evil. "This doesn't bring her back," Roxanne's mother told reporters after the announcement, "but it means the person who took her from us can never hurt another child. That matters. That has to matter." The story made national news as an example of persistence in cold case investigations. The combination of advancing technology, multi-state cooperation, and investigative dedication had finally solved a case that many had assumed would remain forever unsolved. Local churches held memorial services acknowledging both the resolution of the case and the continued grief of those who had loved Roxanne. Her brief life had touched more people than she could ever have known, and her memory had sustained a community's determination to find justice. As the media attention faded and normal life resumed, The people of Garland carried with them the knowledge that some questions eventually find answers, even across decades of silence. The resolution of Roxanne's case catalyzed broader changes in law enforcement approaches to cold cases across Texas and beyond. The analyst who had first identified connections between seemingly isolated crimes became a recognized expert in pattern analysis, helping other jurisdictions recognize when apparently unrelated cases might actually be connected. David Elliott Penton's confession to Roxanne's murder led investigators to re-examine other unsolved cases from the same time period. His movements through multiple states during the 1980s corresponded with several child murders that had remained unsolved, suggesting that Roxanne might not have been his only victim. "This is bigger than just one case," the FBI agent explained during a multi-agency conference on cold case investigations. Penton's pattern of movement and methodology suggests he was responsible for multiple murders across several states. "We need to coordinate our investigations accordingly." The community of Garland found themselves at the center of a broader conversation about child safety and criminal justice. Local law enforcement agencies pointed to Roxanne's case as evidence of why cold case investigations deserve continued resources and attention. Some criminals might escape immediate justice, but advancing technology and persistent investigation could reach across decades to find truth. Roxanne's mother became an advocate for families of unsolved cases, sharing her experience of waiting 14 years for answers while encouraging others not to abandon hope. "The waiting is horrible," she told a support group for families of missing children. "But the truth eventually comes to light. You have to believe that. The truth." Cool days. Detective, now working part-time as a consultant on cold cases, used Roxanne's investigation as a teaching example for younger officers. "Every case matters," he would tell them. "Every victim deserves justice. Sometimes that justice takes longer than we want, but it's still worth pursuing." Media coverage of the case sparked public interest in cold case investigations, leading to increased funding for advanced forensic techniques, (ND) investigative technology. The story of a 3-year-old girl whose murder was solved 14 years later resonated with audiences who understood that justice delayed was still justice served. Academic researchers began studying the case as an example of how criminal investigations had evolved between the 1980s and early 2000s. The contrast between the limited tools available to the original investigators and the advanced techniques that eventually solved the case illustrated how dramatically law enforcement capabilities had expanded. The field near Lavon, where Roxanne's body had been found, became an unofficial memorial site. Community members occasionally left flowers or small toys, quiet tributes to a little girl whose death had changed how an entire region thought about safety and justice. Penton's confession also provided closure for investigators in other states who had worked similar cases. The knowledge that a serial predator was finally identified and permanently incarcerated offered professional satisfaction that went beyond any single case resolution. The annual remembrance of Roxanne's disappearance took on new meaning after Penton's confession. Rather than marking another year of unanswered questions, the November memorial services now honored both her memory and the persistence of those who had refused to let her case be forgotten. Legal scholars noted that the case demonstrated the importance of maintaining detailed case files even when investigations went cold. The meticulous documentation from 1987 had provided the foundation for the successful prosecution 14 years later, proving that thorough initial investigation could pay dividends across decades. As 2003 approached, the ripple effects of solving Roxanne's case continued expanding throughout the law enforcement community. The detective received requests from agencies across the country seeking advice on reopening their own cold cases involving child victims. "The key is never giving up," he would tell them during consulting visits. "Technology changes, but determination has to remain constant. These victims deserve our best efforts, regardless of how much time has passed." The methodology used to identify Penton became a template for other multi-jurisdictional investigations. Pattern recognition software, behavioral analysis, and interstate data sharing had proven their value in ways that transformed how law enforcement approached seemingly unsolvable cases. Roxanne's mother found unexpected strength in helping other families navigate the painful process of waiting for justice. Her experience surviving 14 years of uncertainty qualified her to offer support that no professional counselor could provide. "I know what it feels like to wonder if you'll ever have answers," she would tell families at victim services meetings. but I also know that truth has a way of surviving even when everything else fails. The community of Garland had evolved in the years since Roxanne's murder, but her case remained a defining moment in their collective memory. New residents learned the story from neighbors who had lived through the investigation, ensuring that her legacy continued across generations. Local schools began teaching safety programs that acknowledged the reality of predators without creating unnecessary fear. Roxanne's case provided a framework for discussing difficult topics in age-appropriate ways, helping children understand caution without destroying their sense of security. The detective kept Roxanne's photograph on his desk throughout his consulting work, a reminder of why cold case investigations mattered. Her smile had motivated him through years of frustration and disappointment, and her memory continued inspiring new investigators taking on similar challenges. By the case's 15-year anniversary in 2002, the investigation that had begun with a mother's frantic phone call had become a symbol of persistence, triumphing over time. Justice might be delayed, but it would not be defeated by the passage of years or the challenge of distance. The story of Roxanne Hope Reyes proved that some promises transcend the limitations of immediate circumstance, reaching across decades to honor commitments made to victims who deserved better from the world they had trusted. The legacy of Roxanne's case extended beyond law enforcement into broader social awareness about child safety and community responsibility. The years of investigation had demonstrated that protecting children required vigilance from entire communities, not just individual families. Parents across North Texas referenced the case when teaching their children about stranger danger, but they also emphasized the positive outcome that persistence and cooperation could overcome even the most challenging obstacles to justice. "We learned that evil exists," one Garland resident reflected during a documentary interview years later. "But we also learned that good people don't stop fighting against it, even when the fight takes longer than anyone expected." The technological advances that had enabled Roxanne's case resolution continued accelerating throughout the early 2000s. DNA databases expanded, computer systems became more sophisticated, interstate communication improved. Each advancement represented hope for families whose cases remained unsolved. Penton's confession had also provided investigators with information about his methods and psychology that helped them understand how predators selected victims and avoided detection. This knowledge informed training programs for law enforcement officers and safety education for communities. The detective, now approaching his 70s, remained active in cold case consulting because Roxanne's investigation had taught him that retirement from active duty didn't mean retirement from responsibility to victims. Some commitments transcended employment status. "I promised her I wouldn't give up," he explained to colleagues who wondered why he continued working difficult cases without pay. That promise didn't have an expiration date. Memorial scholarships established in Roxanne's name had helped dozens of children pursue educational opportunities they might not otherwise have had. Her death had become a source of life for others, transforming tragedy into something that honored her memory through positive action. The annual vigil held in Garland each November drew participants from across the region, families of other victims, law enforcement officers, community members who had never forgotten a 3-year-old girl whose case had touched their lives. As the years passed, Roxanne Hope Reyes evolved from victim to symbol, representing both the vulnerability of innocence and the power of persistence. Her case proved that justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied to those who refused to abandon hope. The little girl who had played in her backyard on a November morning in 1987 had become larger than the crime that ended her life, inspiring others to believe that truth eventually prevails over evil, regardless of how long the struggle requires. On a quiet afternoon in November 2005, the detective made his final visit to the field near Lavon, where Roxanne had been found 18 years earlier. The area had changed development, had brought new roads and housing, transforming the isolated location into something more suburban than rural. But at the exact spot where her body had been discovered, a small cross marked the place where innocence had been lost and, eventually, justice had been found. Community members had placed it there after Penton's confession, creating a permanent memorial to a little girl who had not been forgotten. Roxanne's mother stood beside him, both of them looking across the field that had once seemed like the end of hope but had ultimately become the foundation for resolution. The tall grass moved gently in the autumn wind, carrying with it the memory of all the searchers who had combed these fields looking for answers. "I used to hate this place," she said quietly. "Now I think of it differently. This is where she was found, where the truth finally started coming back to us." The detective nodded, understanding the complex relationship between location and memory that defines so many criminal cases. Places where terrible things happen could become sacred through the love and access, determination of those who refused to let victims be forgotten. The community of Garland had grown and changed, but Roxanne's case remained part of their collective identity. New families moving into the neighborhood learned her story from longtime residents who ensured that her memory continued influencing how they protected their own children. The analyst who had first connected Penton's pattern continued working cold cases throughout Texas, using lessons learned from Roxanne's investigation to help solve other mysteries that had seemed impossible. Each resolution honored the precedent set by a 3-year-old girl's case. As the sun began to set over the field near Lavon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have delighted a little girl who loved butterflies, two people who had dedicated years to seeking justice for Roxanne Hope Reyes stood in quiet reflection. Justice had taken 18 years to arrive, but it had arrived. Truth had been buried but not destroyed, delayed but not defeated. Evil had won a battle on November 3, 1987, but good had ultimately won the war. The detective and Roxanne's mother walked back to their cars, leaving behind a field that would forever hold the memory of a little girl whose case had taught an entire community that love is stronger than fear, persistence more powerful than time, and justice more enduring than evil. Some stories never end, they only grow quieter, echoing across years and touching lives in ways that honor the victims who inspired them.